Thank you so much for coming. We're going to do a little introduction and then get off the stage so we can hear the amazing speaker we have today. So good morning. My name is Dan Cano, and I'm the Executive Director of OHRA. I want to welcome everyone to today's presentation by Dr. Gregg Colburn. Gregg's book, published in 2022, titled Homelessness is a Housing Problem, really affirms what we in the industry see every day, that the lack of affordable housing, rather than individual failings, play a much larger role in keeping people unhoused than the community understands. The book notes that when housing is scarce, vulnerabilities and barriers to housing are magnified. We see that every day as industry folks. And there are a few people who understand this more than the three of us standing here today. So please allow us just a couple of moments to share a few thoughts with you.
Good morning, my name is Sam Engel and I'm the Executive Director for OHRA.
Good morning, my name is Melanie Dozier and I'm the Chief Program Officer with Access. Together, alongside many other community partners, we work together to provide shelter, housing, and services to Jackson County.
Each year, our combined organizations shelter nearly 3,000 individuals and families. In addition, our organizations collaborate closely to distribute over $8 million in rent assistance to get people into housing and keep people and individuals, families housed.
Thank you. Yet despite our successes working together to shelter, employ, and link people to the much needed services, the housing problem detailed in Dr. Colburn's book will continue to hinder our ability to create pathways to stable housing.
So as we welcome Dr. Colburn to the microphone, we would like to ask you in the audience who represent civic and community leaders, developers, donors, government agencies, to come together, collaborate, and think creatively about the research and ideas that are presented here and how we can implement them in our communities.
Each day, Access, OHRA, and Rogue Retreat, along with many, many partners in our county, we work hard to reduce barriers to housing, but we can't do it without the support of the community and our leaders. And we can't do it without the research and insight from scholars like Dr. Gregg Colburn. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gregg Colburn to the stage.
All right, I have some to-dos here. How's that? Is that okay? You hear me okay? So that was the mic for the audio. So now this is the mic for all of you. How's this? Are you able to hear me okay? No. I'll lean over. How's this? Okay. I think I'm gonna have to hold on to it. You need that on me as well? Okay. All right. Okay, here we go. Thank you all. I appreciate the invite to your lovely community, appreciate the OHRA folks, and I've had an opportunity to have a couple calls with them, and appreciate the good work that you all are doing. And am excited to share with you some of the ideas from our book and answer the questions and comments that you have afterwards. So I had an interview just before with public radio, and the one thing I want to do is just set some context here in terms of kind of current debates, both in your community, my community, in the nation, and kind of highlight what our contribution is to that conversation. So what I describe right now, what's going on in your community and elsewhere, which is really, really taking up all the oxygen in this debate, is we have people experiencing homelessness in our communities, and what are we going to do to end that experience of homelessness? How are we going to get those people housed? And this is the Housing First debate that we're having across the nation. This is why everyone is irritated and sending me angry emails. And this is a really important question. Of course, we want to make sure that Joe can transition from homelessness into stable housing. And the longer Joe's outside and not receiving support, the more difficult that work is. Okay? And if we leave Joe outside for 5 years, that work is darn near impossible. And then if that doesn't work, we say, Dan, why aren't you working harder? Okay? That's not fair. It's not fair to those organizations. Okay? What people have done is said, Gregg wrote this book about housing, and Gregg is just saying, if we just give Joe a housing unit, everything's going to be fine. That's not the point of the book. The point of the book was to say, there are 2 questions here. One is, how do we get people out of homelessness into housing, which is an important question, one that deserves a lot of attention. That is probably 85% of the conversation, if not 95% of the conversation right now. What our book is really dealing with is, why do we have all these people experiencing homelessness in the first place? It is dealing with the flow of people into this situation. Okay? Both of these are important. I would say our contribution is much more dealing with the upstream side of things. Okay? And the work of OHRA, and everyone around the country who's doing this, will be a heck of a lot easier if there are fewer people entering homelessness. Right? And so when I was in Los Angeles, and I was on a panel with the woman who runs LAHSA, which is the homeless response system in Los Angeles. You want to talk about a hard job? Okay. And of course, every day in the LA Times, it's, we don't know what we're doing, we're spending this money, homelessness is getting worse. She said, we got 25,000 people housed in the last couple of years, out of homelessness. And at the same time, 35,000 people entered homelessness. So what happened? The net number, homelessness went up by 10,000. Everyone writes a story and says they don't know what they're doing. But in fact, they've been doing pretty darn good work in really hard circumstances. But the flow into homelessness has overwhelmed all that good work. And the narrative is that we don't know what we're doing. Okay? That irritates me. I don't think it's fair. Okay? So I've had the opportunity to give a lot of talks around the country and get invited to speak to lots of interesting people, which is great. So in the fall of 24, I got invited. There were 20 of us who got invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Secretary of HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development. So at that time, Acting Secretary Todman was in Biden's cabinet, and she wanted to bring together people to talk about a variety of issues related to housing. And Beth Shin, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, and I were tasked with, this is pretty funny actually. They said, this came from the HUD secretary, we want you to write a 3-page document on how to end homelessness in the United States. And I was so close to responding, saying, anything else you'd like us to do while we're at it? So Beth and I gave it, the college try, and we wrote our 3 pages, and so I presented this to this room with senior leadership from HUD. And I started my presentation with a parable, which I don't think they were expecting. And so I'm going to share that parable with you today. It's called the Parable of the River. It's an African parable. So there's a village along a river in Africa, and people are going about their day, and one day they see a baby in a basket floating down the river. And so the villagers are somewhat concerned. They run out to rescue this baby, and they begin to care for that baby, which is a sign of a caring community. The next day, there's another basket and another baby, and they run out into the water, grab the baby, and pretty soon this is going on day after day after day. There's an entire ecosystem that has now been established within this village to care for these babies. And every day there's another one, and pretty soon we're busy, we wake up, we care for the babies, we're doing all this. One day a woman exits this work and begins to start walking away. And her friends look at her and say, well, where are you going? Somewhat critically, right? You're leaving this important work. And she said, I'm going upstream to find out who's putting all these babies in the water. Okay? I would argue that that's kind of what our book is doing. So by the end of this HUD meeting, they were calling me Upstream Gregg. And this is not to minimize the important work of caring for babies in the river or our homeless response system and crisis response system. It's life-saving, literally life-saving. But I also think that we do not have sufficient resources, human, financial, otherwise, to continue to build larger and larger and larger crisis response systems. New York City is Exhibit A for this. Do you know how many people will sleep in their shelter system tonight? Over 100,000 people. I lived there in 1995. I moved there. There was this guy named Rudy Giuliani. You may have heard of him. He was mayor, and he was cleaning up New York, and he was ripping homeless people off the subways when I would go from the Upper West Side down to Wall Street, and didn't end homelessness. 100,000 people now. And so what has New York done? Because there's not any housing and there's all this flow in, they just build a larger and larger and larger shelter system. To what end? And is that better than being on the street? Sure, we can have debates about whether that's better than unsheltered homelessness. Those are all fair conversations. But if that is the sole response, societal response is, when do we stop? 200,000? 300,000? Right? And so we have got to spend a little time and energy thinking upstream. So that's kind of the purpose of the book. Now you can all go home. Okay, that's the book. The motivation for this book was I moved to Seattle in 2017, and actually, we have time for a quick funny story. So I have a friend who's grew up in Medford. I play golf. I'm a former investment banker, so this is like a vestige of my privileged past. So I have this text thread with my golf buddies. So I said, Casey, I'm going to Medford. Tell me where the statue is of you at the high school, you know, all these kind of dumb jokes. And I said, I'm going to Ashland. And someone said, well, are you going for the Shakespeare Festival? And I said, I made some joke like I'm playing Hamlet or something. And someone said, you know, you should do your talk in Shakespearean language. And so then people were laughing. So last night, I took our book website, put it into Claude, which is an AI tool, and said, please convert this to Shakespearean. And in 2 seconds it did, and I was crying, I was laughing so hard. I texted it to my co-author, and we were howling. I'll share it with you. It is so funny. I'm not a big AI guy, but this was incredibly, incredibly funny. So anyway, we did not write it in Shakespearean tongue. But the motivation for the book was when I would go to meetings in Seattle as a newcomer, there was a recognition that we had a big problem. The problem was getting worse, but there was no agreement on what was causing it. And if you were a concerned citizen reading the Seattle Times every day, you would understandably be very confused about homelessness because there was a different story every single day about the crisis, attributing the crisis to one factor or another. And so even people of goodwill would just say, like, I know we're spending a ton of money. There's all these causes. I see Joe on the street. There's a needle next to him, and it's getting worse. And like, what are we doing? And as someone who studies public policy, that really concerned me because that logic leads you on a downward spiral. Well, why do we spend this money if it's getting worse? Let's stop spending the money, which means the problem's going to get even worse, and that's what we're doing right now. That's the downward spiral in Seattle, and we are Exhibit A for that. So you could argue then that this didn't work real well because this has been out for 4 years. But the purpose of the book was to translate what we've known in the academic literature for some time to a general audience of readers. I wrote this book with my parents in mind, who are both college educated. Neither of them have a PhD in social sciences. I wanted them to be able to understand it. And I figured if I hit the mark with them, then there would be a lot of other people who are just interested in the topic who could pick it up and read it. So I have been shocked that people actually read the book. I mean, it's a book about homelessness. I honestly didn't know if anyone would read it, and it turns out a lot of people read it, and I've been all over the world talking about this book. I need to add Ashland, Oregon to the list now. And this isn't all the places, but it's a whole bunch of them. And so last week I was in St. Louis talking to a bunch of Jesuits. I mean, it's just the audiences are really interesting. They had a big conference. And so one thing that's, I think, relevant to Ashland is there's a subset of communities on this list that are so similar to your community. And so I'm just going to go down Bend, Oregon, San Luis Obispo, Asheville, North Carolina, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Sun Valley, Idaho, etc. The dynamics are almost identical. I went for a walk last night, and I went out and got coffee this morning. I was like, I could be in Asheville, North Carolina right now. Okay? It is a beautiful place, mountainous. This is a place where people want to retire, people with resources. It's kind of a hippie community, and all this stuff comes together to create a really cool town, and it's a big, big challenge. The problems that I hear from the city council in all these cities are almost identical. Bend being obviously a little bit bigger and a little earlier than you, but similar dynamics. And which is really interesting. So one is that you might derive some comfort in that, in the sense that you're not alone, but you also might be a source of concern to say, like, there's something going on here that we're seeing in other places that unless we kind of change the trajectory here, we know it's coming, right? Bend has been radically changed. And I'm sure for those of you who've been here for a long time, you would say the same thing about your community. Asheville, North Carolina, the visible homelessness was unbelievable. Art gallery, unsheltered person experiencing homelessness, art gallery, great restaurant. I mean, it's just the reality. It's just the reality in that community. So I have a lot of time on planes. I sketched this out on a plane. And there's a lot here, but it was a way for me to kind of organize my thoughts a little bit. This book is about homelessness, which I have up in yellow in the upper right-hand corner. And we attribute homelessness to this housing crisis. But this housing crisis has all sorts of other consequences that we're not writing about in this book, but we easily could have. We could have written a book that long commutes is a housing problem. Why do people have 1.5 hour commutes? It's not because they love to sit in their car for 1.5 hours. It's because they can't afford housing near their employment, right? We could write a book that says the housing crisis is a driver of economic and wealth inequality in the United States. If you're a renter in Seattle, the last 10 years has been a nightmare. My wife and I bought a house in 2017, and it's darn near doubled in value. Inequality. If you're fortunate enough to be on the right side or wrong side, depending on how you look at it, the housing crisis has been either really good or really, really bad for you, right? Political conflict. The housing crisis is a massive, it's like pouring gasoline on political conflict. We'll talk about more of that in a little bit. So anyway, the point is that homelessness is not isolated, an isolated consequence of this housing crisis. It's one of many. Okay, so when we talk about homelessness and the causes of homelessness, this is when things start to get a little complicated. Okay? And causation in the social world is complicated because human beings are complicated. Right? If we drop a pen and say what caused that, we would say gravity. In some cases, the physical sciences causation is easier than in the social sciences. So there's a lot of different ways of knowing. One of the ways of knowing about homelessness is we ask people experiencing homelessness, why are you homeless? When we ask those questions, we get really honest and blunt answers. I drink too much. Lost my job. Right? My boyfriend beat me up in Iran. Now I'm homeless. Okay? So we have to honor these explanations. And the central concern that I had when writing this book was I knew about this. I've done these interviews. I've listened to these people. I've never experienced homelessness, but I've talked to a lot of people and been in community with a lot of people who have. And I knew I'd probably be standing up there in a white dress shirt and a blue sport coat saying it's the housing market, and there's a woman next to me saying it's domestic violence. Right? It's because my boyfriend beat me up and now I'm out of here. And so who am I to say that that's not true? Of course it is. That's her experience. And so the purpose of the book was to honor both of those and not put them in competition with one another. And the way that we do that is to use this notion of root causes versus precipitating events. Okay? Of course, domestic violence in the wrong set of circumstances can produce homelessness. It is a precipitating event. Relational breakdown is many times a cause of homelessness. But the context in which that happens really matters. If my wife and I hope it doesn't happen, were to get divorced tonight, neither of us would be homeless tomorrow. Okay? In that case, relational breakdown would not be a precipitating event for homelessness because we're fortunate to have a social network and resources such that circumstances would not result in us being unhoused. Okay? So these two things work together. The way we highlight this for our readers is this metaphor of musical chairs. You know how the game is played. 10 friends, 10 chairs. Music starts, everyone's walking around, leader pulls one chair out, we now have 9 chairs. Music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone loses. In our little metaphor, Mike was the loser. He was on crutches after spraining his ankle, and he was unable to move quickly when the music stopped. So if we interviewed Mike after the game and said, Mike, why are you chairless? What would he say? Had a bad ankle. Right? That's true. That probably did contribute to Mike losing the game. But if we ask a different question, which is, why didn't Mike have a chair? It's because we didn't have 10 chairs. Had we had 10 chairs when the music stopped, what would have happened? He would have hobbled over, found a chair, and sat down. Might have taken longer, might not have been pretty. This is obviously overly simplistic, but this is exactly what's going on in Seattle every day. We see Joe on the street, and Joe's in crisis, and we say, of course Joe's homeless, he's addicted, he's mentally ill, he's physically disabled, he's black, whatever the case may be. And those attributes or conditions certainly probably made it more likely that Joe would lose the game. But what we miss in that interaction is the structural deficit of housing, of affordable housing, that's creating the conditions for Joe to experience homelessness in Seattle. And yet and we're all guilty of this, I'm guilty of this, what do we focus on? We focus on the needle next to Joe. We focus on Joe's conditions as opposed to the fact that We don't have enough housing that's affordable for enough people in Seattle. The people who work at Amazon in Seattle are going to win the game every time. I describe them as, do you remember Usain Bolt, the Jamaican sprinter, fastest man in the world? It's like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt. He's going to win every time. The Amazon people are going to win every time. I have a lot of friends who work at Amazon. Not one of them's homeless. They all found housing. Okay? So this is kind of, this context is really the gist of the book, which is how do we think about individual vulnerability in the context of a housing market that's really, really difficult. I'm not an attorney, but if I were an attorney, I would use the word stipulated, which is I will stipulate that if you're addicted, if you're mentally ill, if you're poor, you're more likely to experience homelessness. We don't have to argue about this. That is not the point of our book, is to undermine that. That is absolutely true. But we also know that there are people with those experiences and conditions in every jurisdiction in the United States. And some places have a lot of homelessness and some don't. So that's kind of the head scratcher that we're trying to deal with in this book. The other thing that's really important is we all form a perception of homelessness based on what we see with our five senses, or that we use with our five senses. What we see, what we hear, what we use, and all that kind of stuff, right? And the problem with that is we only see a small fraction of the phenomenon of homelessness. If you walk down 3rd Avenue in Seattle, you see a sliver of the homeless population who's in crisis. And those people deserve our care and compassion. But what we don't see in that small sliver is the women and children in shelter, are the people who are living in their cars, showering at the YMCA, and then going to work. All of that is below the water. It's the part of the iceberg that we don't see. And so therefore, because of what we visibly observe, we end up creating a narrative of this phenomenon that is simple, and in fact, it's highly complex. Thank you. So what we try to do in the book is to answer a relatively simple question, which is why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? And the reason we ask that question is if we can provide a credible answer, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of this crisis. As civic leaders, as elected leaders, as policymakers, we should focus some time and attention on that. Okay? My city has 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago, my former city. Is it just because we have more people who are vulnerable in Seattle? That logically makes sense. If poverty, mental illness, addiction cause homelessness at the individual level, if you have more people with those conditions, you'll have more homelessness. Right? That would get an A in a logic class. Turns out it's not true. Our thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities, produce homelessness at high levels. And these individual vulnerabilities serve as a sorting mechanism in tight housing markets. And those individual vulnerabilities receive disproportionate attention at cocktail parties and in the Seattle Times and on social media, Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of the analytical stuff here, which we don't have to belabor because I've kind of given you the gist of the story already. So the book uses the 30 largest metros in the United States as the sample, okay? And so what we're trying to do in this sample, and I apologize this is small, is to understand regional variation. So some places count at the city level, some count at the county level. This is a bureaucratic nuance that isn't important. One's not right, one's not wrong, it's just different. So when you look at cities, New York, San Francisco, Boston, DC are about 5, 6, 7 times Chicago. We want to understand that variation. Other jurisdictions count at the county level, including mine in King County and Portland, Multnomah. You can see huge variation over Cook County, which is Chicago, and Hillsborough, which is Tampa. So the point here is we have massive differences in per capita rates of homelessness. Why might that be? Let's use some pretty simple statistics and test all the explanations for homelessness and see what explains this best. Okay? And the logic of the book is we will take one conventional explanation, we'll test it. If it doesn't do a good job, we cross it off and we move through all these explanations. Okay? We good? Everyone okay? All right. Buckle your seatbelts. Here we go. Okay, so let's start with poverty. Of course, homelessness is a poverty problem. At its fundamental nature, homelessness is a poverty problem. If you lack financial resources, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. For those of you who haven't looked at basic kind of statistical analyses in a while. I'm just going to orient you in terms of what you're looking at. This is the poverty rate in a community. This is the x-axis. This would be high poverty jurisdictions. 30, 35, 40% people experiencing poverty in that community. And then the y-axis here is per capita rates of homelessness. High homelessness, low homelessness. So what's interesting here is there is a statistical relationship between rates of poverty and rates of homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what we might intuitively expect, which is, think Cleveland and Detroit here. The places with the highest rates of poverty in the United States have some of the lowest rates of homelessness. Greg, you just said homelessness is a poverty problem. It is at the individual level. At the community level, homelessness thrives amidst affluence. Homelessness is the greatest in our richest cities: Boston, San Francisco, Seattle. Okay? So homelessness thrives amidst affluence, not poverty. This doesn't mean that poverty doesn't matter. What it means is being poor in an affluent place has huge consequences. Which is why, if you look at that tour, list of cities that I visited, I've gone to a lot of rich places. I've also been to Flint, Michigan. What a disaster Flint has been. Sad. Homelessness isn't a big issue. There's housing all over the place. It's boarded up. Right? So we cannot blame the homelessness crisis in Oregon and Washington and California on disproportionate numbers of people who are poor. In fact, we have far fewer poor people than Cleveland, Detroit, et cetera. So we can't blame poverty on this disproportionality. Okay, serious mental illness. This is when people's blood pressure starts to rise. This is split up between pre-2020 and post-2020 because the federal government changed the way it calculates this, which just made my life more difficult. These data are updated also. The book came out in 2022 based on data through 2019. We've now updated that. I haven't published a new book, but these are new data based on that. In essence, the logic of the book holds. There's not new information post-2019 that changes things. What this is, the rates of serious mental illness in every state in the nation plotted against rates of homelessness, and what you'll see is a flat line, which basically means this is a nothing burger. There's nothing going on here. We don't have more mental illness in Washington, California, and Oregon than other places, but we got a heck of a lot more homelessness. Again, this doesn't mean that our response to behavioral health challenges has been adequate. It's been grossly inadequate. Okay? We do not have sufficient mental health beds in the state of Washington. Nowhere near. Has that exacerbated this crisis? Sure it has. But in terms of pure numbers, we don't have more mental illness here than in Ohio. Okay? But the combination of untreated mental illness in a place with really high housing markets, that's a problem. That's the story. This is rates of substance use disorder. What you can see is there's a mild positive here, but it's nowhere near statistically significant. If you've R-squareds of 0.06, 0.1, not much of a story here. What you see later is like R-squareds of 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, which are far more convincing. This really, really irritates people because it flies in the face of what they observe on the street. Greg, how dare you suggest that this isn't a drug problem? Okay. And what I say to people is like, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? They do. And what's the worst drug problem in the United States over the last 15 years? West Virginia. Highest overdose death rates, the 5 states with the highest overdose death rate in the United States are West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, and then another southeastern state, maybe Louisiana. Yeah, I mean, all those states have far higher overdose deaths than California and Oregon and Washington. And we aren't writing about the homelessness problem in those jurisdictions. If this were fundamentally a drug problem, we should see massive rates of homelessness in West Virginia, and we don't. Again, this doesn't mean that we don't we don't get an A in terms of a response to substance use disorders. No, we haven't done a great job. We don't have enough treatment. Two things can be true at the same time. But if this, at its core, were a drug problem, we would not see huge rates of homelessness in the places that we do. The other point that's really, really important on these behavioral health challenges is the causal arrow goes in both directions, which is my behavioral health challenge might cause me to experience homelessness. It might disrupt my life in a way that leads me to homelessness. And then you see Greg on the street and I'm behaving erratically, and they're like, well, yes, he's mentally ill. We also know from the research is that if you leave me on the street for 5 years without getting medical care, not being fed, being traumatized, victimized, I'll probably develop a behavioral health challenge. Okay? And as I say to people, if I were living on the streets in Seattle, I would medicate. And it wouldn't be the glass of Cabernet I had with some of our friends last night. Okay? So when we observe someone on the street, we need to sit back and say, well, this could be a cause or a consequence of this really, really traumatic experience of experiencing homelessness. And so what I say to elected leaders all over is like, I understand why you don't want that person on your street. If you own a restaurant, I don't want someone urinating outside my restaurant. I totally get that. And if we want less of that activity, how about we house some folks? There's huge racial disparity in rates of homelessness. Black, brown, indigenous folks are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. Okay? But what's interesting is when you plot the racial makeup of a city, in this case the rates, the level of people identifying as black or African American in a city, there's actually a negative relationship, which seems to be somewhat counterintuitive. Okay? So how do I explain this? The way I explain this is that race doesn't cause homelessness. Being black doesn't cause homelessness. If it did, Chicago would have really high rates of homelessness because their black population is far higher than Seattle, which is a disproportionately white city. Okay? But we don't observe that. Chicago has far lower rates of homelessness. Race doesn't cause homelessness, racism causes homelessness. Okay? Racism helps determine who in a community is more likely to experience homelessness, which is why black people are overrepresented in every jurisdiction in the United States. Helps to determine who in a community is going to experience homelessness. It doesn't explain why Seattle has more homelessness than Chicago. Okay? So we've not found a good answer to our question. We're still looking. So now we're going to just look at some local context. This is what I would describe as the cocktail party conversation about homelessness. And some of you may have heard me say this before, but one of the interesting experiences about writing a book about homelessness in Seattle is, and this is probably true in Ashland too, but you go to a party and people are always talking about, they're either talking about how much their house is worth or how angry they are about homelessness. Right? Housing just occupies a lot of attention in our community. And inevitably someone will be ranting and raving about homelessness, and someone at the party will say, you know, Greg wrote a book about homelessness. And then I get pulled into this conversation and my wife goes, oh no, here we go again. And what proceeds to happen is I'm sitting there holding a glass of red wine and people are lecturing me about the causes of homelessness. It's unbelievable. My best friend has a PhD in physics. No one lectures him about physics. like, oh, Josh has a PhD in physics. And everyone says, that's cool. And then they say, Greg has a PhD and he studies housing. And they're like, well, I'm going to tell you what the story is. I'm like, based on what? But to a certain extent, we're all experts in housing because we've all lived in housing, right? And I guess I interact with the physical world, but I don't know a thing about physics. But I do know what housing means to me, why it's important, how I accessed housing. I worked hard, I got a job, I bought a house. That's my experience with housing. Why don't you do that? Okay? So this is kind of what happens. Greg, LA is warm and Chicago's cold. That's why LA has a lot of homelessness. End of story. Has anyone ever heard this argument? Yeah. So, and I'll just smile and say, well, you know, there are other warm places in Arizona and Florida and Texas that don't have a lot of homelessness. And Boston is terribly cold in January. They have a ton of homelessness. We can't blame Mother Nature. We'd love to blame Mother Nature. I fundamentally believe the reason we use this argument is because we'd love to blame Mother Nature and not have to look in the mirror. I think that's why we want Mother Nature to be at fault. We can't blame Mother Nature. If we weren't so generous, Greg, people would stop moving here to experience homelessness. I was telling folks at dinner last night, I have heard this argument in every city I have visited. And I always say to people, again, I told you, I'm not a physicist. This is not how magnets work. Everyone can't be the recipient. Okay? When I was getting my PhD at the University of Minnesota, people were blaming homelessness in Minneapolis on folks from Chicago. It's people from Chicago moving here. We're generous. We were generous. Minnesota's a pretty generous place. We studied it. I didn't find any evidence of that. My first meeting in Seattle, they said, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness. I said, well, that's what Minneapolis said. Where are your people coming from? California. I'm like, okay. I go to California for meetings. We're a magnet for homelessness. I was like, you can't be. You're sending your people to Seattle. I just heard. And what is California? Where are people coming from? Texas. Which we love to blame Texas for a lot of things. And I always say to people like, okay, so you're having trouble securing housing in Texas, so why don't I move to one of the most expensive places in the United States? That'll work. It doesn't make any logical sense, yet we make this argument over and over and over again. When we look at benefit generosity, we see no relationship between benefit generosity and homelessness. And this doesn't, I support generous benefits, but our benefits in the United States are not generous at all. So Iowa's $100 more per month in terms of welfare support. So you're going to move to Iowa City for an extra $100 and leave your family and friends and your social network wherever you might be? Not going to happen. We moved a family of 4 from Minneapolis to Seattle in 2017, 2 middle school kids, and it sucked. It really did. It was hard. And we had every advantage under the sun. We had to find housing in Seattle, miserable. New schools for the kids. We didn't have any friends. I had a new job. Now imagine you have nothing. And we had to leave a whole bunch of people who loved and cared for us in Minneapolis. Now imagine you have nothing. Are you going to do that? Come on. Okay, so this may not surprise you given the title of the book, but once we get to the housing market, we start to see a more convincing explanation. One of the other funny things about writing a book is a somewhat, especially on a topic like this, is a vulnerable exercise, which I didn't really realize until once it came out. Right? There are a lot of people who are angry with me, and people can write book reviews. And I remember one time seeing an interview with Steven Spielberg, and he said that every time he has a new movie comes out, he's still nervous. And he's Steven Spielberg, right? Because the reviews come out, and sometimes they're like, this is the worst movie he's ever made, and he's like, it still stings. And I'm Steven Spielberg. So I will say, every time a book review comes out, I'm always like, And they've been overwhelmingly positive, which is great. My favorite one came from Fran Quigley, who's a professor at Indiana University. And I knew of Fran, but I didn't know him at the time. He is pretty funny. Gregg Colburn and Clayton Page Alderton would make lousy mystery writers. But they have gifted us with an important new book about housing. With zero effort at deception, they happily give away their thesis with the book title, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. So I sent Fran a note, and I said, you win the award for best opening sentence to a book review. So we are not trying to be mystery writers. There is a strong relationship between rents in a community and rates of homelessness. Now, if you remember these numbers before, what do we see? 0.24, 0.54. Much, much higher than anything else we tested in the book. Places with really high rents have high rates of homelessness. There's no Nobel Prize coming for this analysis. Right? It's pretty intuitive. This is not overly complex, but it's a heck of a lot better than the nonsense people are blurting at me at parties on Saturday night. Okay? This is rental market vacancy rates. And what we'll see is when vacancy rates get low, meaning you don't have a lot of rental housing, homelessness tends to be higher. When you combine these two, because these are related variables, it's not a perfect predictor, but there is no city in the United States with high rents and low vacancies that doesn't have a big problem with homelessness. If you're a baseball fan, we're batting 1,000. Okay? There's not a counterexample. And so, is it the only part of the story? No. But if we don't figure this out, I have real concerns about our ability to ever get out of this mess. Why is it? Why do some places have high rents and low vacancies? This is a real brief economics lecture, but this is really thinking about the supply and demand for housing. When we think about demand for housing, the primary drivers of demand for housing are population growth and income. If you have lots of people who are making a lot of money moving to your community like Seattle, you're going to have high demand for housing. Communities can respond to that demand in a variety of ways. They can build a bunch of housing or they cannot. Economists have taught us that the two drivers of supply elasticity, which is just a fancy term for how much housing you build, is topography and regulatory environment. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to build more housing. It's harder for you to respond to increased demand because you can't build on hills and you can't build on Puget Sound. Okay? There are other places, and then regulatory environment. There are places where it's easier to build housing than others. That's just a fact. It's easier to build housing in Texas than it is in San Francisco. 3 years to get a permit to build housing in San Francisco right now. People are dying in the streets. I'm not anti-regulation. I think there's an important role for regulation in society, but I think that is almost unconscionable. We have got to figure out how to do this more quickly. If you talk to developers, like, we're done. It costs me so much money to sit around and be paying interest on these loans while we're waiting to get a permit. We got to figure this out. So low supply elasticity means you can have a lot of demand for housing and you don't build it. So what does this show us? This is a really interesting quadrant. I don't usually find myself in the camp of advocating for Texas-style policy. But what's interesting is what happened. Charlotte, San Antonio, Austin all grew just as fast as Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle. But what happened? They built a ton of housing. Why? They have a really elastic housing market. It's easy to build, and they can sprawl. They don't have topographical constraints. And so that might not be the preferred mode of housing production in Seattle. One, we can't sprawl. We have urban growth boundaries, and we have mountains and water and things. But the point is that if you build the housing, it helps. So these communities in the 2010s had rapid population growth, and they avoided a housing crisis because they built a bunch of housing. How about the bottom right-hand quadrant? This is the perfect storm for a housing and homelessness crisis. A bunch of people move there, you don't build much housing, what happens? Look at these rental market vacancy rates. That's for an entire decade. This is super, super unhealthy. This is like rocket fuel for rents. So the fact that we had the experience in Seattle that we did is tragic, but 100% predictable. We actually watched San Francisco go through it, and we were behind them. Our tech boom lagged San Francisco's. And now we're in the same mess. So when I travel around the country, what I say is, learn from us. As you grow and prosper, that's a good thing. I would much rather be a mayor of a city that's growing and prospering than Detroit. That's a really hard job. But the problem is what we've not figured out is how to grow and prosper and not leave people behind. That's the story in Seattle. When people say we didn't build enough housing for the folks, I was like, that's the wrong framing. Every one of those folks found housing. What we didn't do is build sufficient housing so that people who've been in Seattle for 3 generations could stay. We pushed them out. And in some cases, pushing them out means they have an hour-and-a-half commute. In other cases, push them out literally means they're sitting on 3rd Avenue. Okay? So what I say in Indianapolis and in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa is like I'm the ghost of Christmas to come from Dickens' Christmas Carol. Learn from our mistakes. Don't repeat them. Right? You are not at the scale of these cities, but you are a prosperous community. And that has a lot of good things, and it has some consequences. So I'm going to wrap up here just with kind of last 5 minutes, and then we'll get to Q&A, just with some updates, because the book came out a while ago. So as I said, what have we learned? What has the data told us since publication? Generally speaking, the logic of the book holds. COVID distorted a lot of our data on housing, and we had weird dynamics with people leaving San Francisco, and so vacancy rates went from like 3 to 9 and then came back down. And so there's some noise during the pandemic period, but generally speaking, the logic holds. We still have our problem children on the coast, and then we have troubling trends in Phoenix and Austin and Sacramento and Vegas and Denver, where they're exhibiting housing market dynamics and homelessness that looks a lot like coastal cities. So the only sliver of good news is if you're the author of the book that the logic holds. Selfishly speaking, it's bad if you care about humanity. Okay? And so it's funny, I've had a lot of people come after me and they said, well, what about this case? Gregg wants this to be the case. I say, I don't want this to be. I would be thrilled if someone bucked this trend. I've always said, I would love for Seattle or San Francisco or Boston or New York to basically figure this out and say, 1, Gregg's either wrong, or 2, we built a bunch of housing and figured this out. That would be the best thing possible. The last thing I want to do is have 13 editions of this book telling the same story for the next 20 years, which is my fear of where we're going. What's the response been? Overwhelmingly positive. I've gotten to speak at a lot of cool places. People have read the book. It's been really fun, but there's some people who are really, really angry. So on the right side, this showed up in my mailbox at UW last fall. Postmark, there was no name, return address, but the postmark was Boise, and it says homelessness is a 75% mental. They cut the cover off the book. It's like aggressive, but at least they bought the book, Homelessness is a 75% mental health addiction problem. Gregg, take your woke goggles off to solve the problem. Okay? A couple months ago, there's a retired professor from Colby College who lives in Seattle, and he is kind of my protector. I had to leave Twitter a long time ago because the attacks were unbelievable. They posted pictures of my home with its value and said, this guy's lecturing us about housing. I'm like, well, yeah, it's an expensive house. I was like, but that's the point. There aren't any cheap houses in Seattle. And am I a hypocrite? Sure. I live a very comfortable life. This hit a couple months ago. Gregg is the author of Homelessness, a Housing Problem that Washington elected leaders have turned to as their solutions manual. This book has misguided policymakers nationwide and killed our loved ones. Buy this book and post pictures of you burning it. So UW security is now involved. It's like, why are we so angry? And there's a lot more that have curse words in them that I'm not going to put up here. But so people are really agitated about this. And it usually comes down to the fact that I'm either not going to force people into treatment or the fact that I'm minimizing drugs, which is not what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is elevate the importance of housing in this conversation. So how are we responding? I would say, generally speaking, not well. Okay? As you know, just being down the road from Grants Pass, we had a Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago. If you haven't listened to the deliberations, I highly recommend it. I listened to all 3 hours. It is fascinating and tragic at the same time. You had Supreme Court justices of the United States debating whether a basic human function like sleep can be criminalized. Literally for a half hour, they were going back and forth on this. What if they have a pillow? What if they don't have a pillow? Okay. So what did they decide? Law of the land. We can criminalize on public land. Okay. So with a green light, and some of this is very political, but it's important to know that. So I signed on to amicus briefs for this case with a lot of researchers around the country, which was saying we should not criminalize homelessness, and here's the evidence around that. There were a lot of elected leaders on the West Coast who signed amicus briefs on the other side, including Gavin Newsom, who's governor of California. Do you know what happened after the Grants Pass case the next day? Gavin Newsom is in a photo shoot with his blue jeans on. Hair still look great. It always does. Throwing people's stuff into a dumpster. Okay? So this is not just a red-blue issue, right? There were plenty of Democratic blue politicians who wanted to have the authority to criminalize homelessness because it made their job a little easier. We've seen this around the country, very, very aggressive responses to homelessness. We see a lot of state-level policymaking activity around criminalization. It can either be called criminalization or anti-camping is another way to frame this. I have a Google alert on the name of the book and my name just to see how it's being used, which is fascinating. So this came from Oklahoma. This journalist must have read our book, and she was interviewing the author of a criminalization bill in the Oklahoma legislature. And in the interview, she said, Representative Weaver, do you feel like homelessness is a housing problem? He said, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have any place to live. So I sent this to Margot Kuchel. She's at the University of California, San Francisco. She authored the big homelessness study in California. Margot and I are writing a book right now. And I texted this to her, and she's like, we need T-shirts with that on it. This was Christmas morning, my Christmas morning. I'd been interviewed for this New York Times piece, and it was basically an analysis of Housing First, which, and I like Jason. I think he's a good guy. I don't think it was his best work. And my phone was blowing up Christmas morning. I was like, oh, all these people wishing me Merry Christmas. How lovely. Well, it wasn't. It was people either saying, oh, your quote in the New York Times, or people mad at me, and it was really something. So this is like, when I talk about oxygen, this is taking up all the oxygen right now. We're fighting about this issue. And because we're not having progress, what are we doing? This is a chilling article from the New York Times. Salt Lake City is building a massive camp outside of the city to round people up and put them in. And this is not meant to be humorous. We do not, as a species, have a very good track record of building camps and rounding people up and putting them in. Yet we continue. We don't have a good track record of building camps and rounding people up and putting them into camps. We keep doing the same damn thing over and over and over again, okay? And I'm deeply concerned, especially with the World Cup coming to my city and a lot of cities. What's gonna happen? I guarantee you we're gonna round people up in Seattle. Because there's huge pressure from the federal government and the world that they want Seattle to be spick and span when, now we're 4 weeks out. It's in June. So is this hopeless? It's not hopeless. When I was at HUD, and the HUD secretary said, what would you do if you were me? And I said, I would go to the highest mountaintop and scream about the success we've had with veterans homelessness. We cut veteran homelessness by 55% in 10 years, 2010 to 2020. How and why did we do that? Two things. One is, my dad's generation, the Vietnam generation, was grossly overrepresented in the homeless population when they came back from Vietnam. As a nation, regardless of your political persuasion, I don't think we felt good about how we treated those veterans. So now we have men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we basically said as a nation, let's not repeat those mistakes. I'm all for that. So we had Republicans and Democrats say, how about we fund housing and services through HUD and the VA and get people the support they need, and what happened? We cut homelessness by 55%. This is not rocket science. The one time we had a scaled an effort from the federal government, we had massive success in reducing homelessness. And people say, it's hopeless. It's not hopeless. Why do we do it? It's good politics to house veterans. My dad's a veteran, my grandpa's a veteran. I'm all for housing veterans. I think it's great. I'm also for housing people who aren't veterans. We drew the line there. That's why we had success with veterans and not elsewhere. If we drew the line elsewhere, we could have similar success. The evidence base is clear, we're just choosing not to. That's not the fault of the intervention, it's the fault of all of us, and those of us who are making decisions on this. We've seen a lot of success in certain jurisdictions. I brag about Denver. I've gotten to know the Denver folks. They've done a really good job. Really good job. The mayor of Denver said, let's get a bunch of people off the streets, and they did, 1,000 people into hotels and other temporary accommodation. And they built goodwill through that process. And now when they come back for more money or more support, they can say, remember I told you what I was gonna do? We did it, and now let's do that. The problem in Seattle is we've not put points in the scoreboard. So there's a political strategy on this. What I tell people is small successes are really important. I want to end homelessness, but to get there, you have to have small successes and deliver such that the people who are voting for you can say, oh yeah, you told me this and I did it. If you say, I'm going to end homelessness in 4 years, you're going to be out of office in 4 years because we know that that's not going to happen. That's Seattle. We're going to have a different mayor every 4 years. Progressive, more moderate, progressive, more moderate. It's just the pendulum swings back and forth. That didn't work, so we'll do something else. That didn't work, let's do something else. This is why I'm not running for mayor. We have success, then why do we have all this skepticism? This is a political cartoon in the Seattle Times earlier this year. The top one is 2015, disorder, homeless encampment. Homelessness in King County before billions of tax dollars were spent on the problem. Down below, a decade later, 2025, same picture. Homelessness in King County after billions of dollars are spent. This is the fundamental political challenge we have. Our lack of success and progress is inviting this critique. Shame on us. This is more convincing than someone having to read a 250-page book on homelessness that Gregg wrote. This tells the story. This is winning. What's going on here? This is a real problematic rental market vacancy in your county. 5% is kind of the neutral point for rental market vacancy. Below 5% would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing. From 2014, basically to the pandemic, you were way below 5%. And what happened? Your rents have gone from $900 to $1,400. This is basic economics, okay? And income has not. That's the other point, right? When you look at this, both in your community and across the nation, renter incomes have been flat, inflation adjusted for generations, and rents just keep going, okay? So this is not surprising. This is consistent with economic theory, but this exacts a huge cost on your community, especially low-income folks. This is per capita rates of homelessness in your county. Again, perfectly consistent with the logic of this argument. So what do? My hope with this is that we kind of counter this argument of we spent a lot of money and the problem got worse by highlighting two things. One is a lot of the money we spend on homelessness is in response. It's creating a crisis response system. And thank goodness that system exists because we're caring for people who desperately need it. It saves lives. Right? That's the work of OHRA. If that's all we do, though, OHRA just needs to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That should not be our goal. We also need to be thinking upstream and creating more housing that's more affordable such that there are fewer people showing up at the shelter door. And that's hard. Building housing is hard. It's expensive. Politically, it's tough. I don't want multifamily housing in my neighborhood. Okay? Who should do this, public or private? Both. I get accused of being a shill for corporate interests and a socialist. Same talk, same guy. Gregg is a shill because he wants it to be easier, cheaper, and faster for private developers to build housing. I do. I think it'd be way better if that were the case. And will they make some money in the process? Yep. That's our system. You can love it or hate it, that's our system. Shill. There are also going to be plenty of people who won't be able to afford that housing. And therefore, there will be a need for us to figure out what's the gap. I can afford $800 a month. I can't afford $1,400. We probably need some subsidy. Gregg's a socialist. I'm not, independent of whether I'm a socialist or not, I think it's a crappy argument. It's not socialism, it's just math. It's just saying that we have a gap. That's all it is. And so we can either say there's this gap, we have a math problem, and what's our response? To date, our response has been tough shit for those people. And we see the consequence of that response. Okay? So I'm less concerned about whether I'm a shill or a socialist other than saying we need all the people in the boat rowing together. We want developers there. We want policymakers there such that it's easier, cheaper, and faster to build housing and that we have supports for people who can't afford that housing. Easier said than done. So my hope with this book is we take some attention off of Joe, not because Joe doesn't deserve our care and dignity, because it's too easy to walk by Joe and say, I feel bad for Joe, but Joe made some poor decisions in his life. That brief interaction absolves me of responsibility, right? If instead I see Joe as a consequence of structures that Gregg Colburn has contributed to, then at night when I'm brushing my teeth, looking at myself in the mirror, I say, well then, what am I gonna do? What are we gonna do? And that's scary, because these structural problems have been, generations in the making. It's a lot easier to just blame Joe and then go about my day and teach and do my things and, I'm a good guy, right? Structural problems require structural solutions. And structural solutions are hard because they require resources, political will, all the stuff that's in short supply. But this is not hopeless. We know what works. We've decided not to scale those solutions, and that's why where we are. Okay? So my hope is that your community and my community understands these dynamics, not only provides support for people experiencing homelessness, but also creates capacity in the housing system such that we have fewer people in that system, and hopefully in 10 years, we're not saying 2025, 2026 was the glory days. That's my fear, is we're gonna look back and say 26 was pretty good, because this could get much, much worse. And that's my hope and prayer is that doesn't happen. Thank you very much, I appreciate it.